had to start off the week with all the craziness that happened last week with the Boston Celtics. They've had a really bad start to the season. They're sitting at 4-6, which is good enough for 12th in the East. They could be worse. I mean, they definitely, a couple of those games they could have lost. A couple more they could have won. They've had some close losses, but sitting at 4-6. Marcus Smart threw everyone under the bus last week. I'll read off his exact quote here. "I would just like to play basketball. Every team knows we are trying to go to Jason and Jalen, and every team is programmed and studies to stop Jason and Jalen. I think everybody's scouting report is to make those guys pass the ball. They don't want to pass the ball, and that's something that they are going to learn. They're still learning, and we're proud of the progress they are making, but they're going to have to make another step to find ways not only to create for themselves, but create for others on the team to open up the court for them later in the game, where they don't always have to take those tough shots or tough matchups when they do get one-on-one and see a trap." Just reading that, it's something that we've been asking for them to do, and they're learning. We just got to continue to help those guys do that and help out our team. Kind of, he's not wrong with a lot of what he said. When I first heard that, I thought it was more of a negative spot on the coaching. But when he says that they don't want to pass the ball, that's I can't imagine they took that well. Marcus had 0 assists in that game, so I feel like it's kind of falling on deaf ears at that point when your point guard has 0 assists and he's criticizing the two best players on the team for not passing the ball enough. And that was during the Chicago game where they blew like a 20-plus point lead in the fourth, and it was just a complete train wreck down the stretch. They were getting good shots with Jason and Jalen, so that wasn't really their problem. They just missed a lot of those looks. And later in the week, they have a players-only meeting. You've got to feel good about that. I'm just kidding. You never feel good about that when you're less than 10 games into the season and you're having a players only meeting. From the reports I read, it wasn't particularly productive. So I don't know. They ended up kind of bouncing back with a couple of wins. They ended up coming back after they got off to a slow start against Orlando, and then they crushed Miami. And then they had a competitive game last night against the Mavericks that they lost because Luka is Luka. Particularly with the 2 wins back to back. The Orlando game, I'm not going to be jumping up and down for a victory against Orlando saying that they've turned the season around. The Miami game either. I mean, normally if you looked at the box score in like a vacuum and you saw that they held Miami to, 80 points, something like that, you'd be really excited about the defensive effort. Miami was just, I don't know where their head was at that game, but they had like 18 turnovers and 18 assists. So 1-to-1 assist to turnover ratio, and they went 8 for 41 on threes, I believe. So it was just a disastrous game for them. Their energy wasn't there. They were letting Boston get easy baskets. And then they were throwing the ball over the gym and missing everything. So it was just a weird game for Miami. So I'm not going to jump on the Celtics bandwagon for a couple of weird wins. And then also, a close game against Dallas, who I think's record is a little bit better than they actually are. And I'll talk about that later in the week. I think Marcus in particular is, I don't like him getting on guys because he's kind of been a weak spot for them this year. I kind of noticed it last year a little bit, and I'm noticing it a lot more this year. Defensively, he's just not the same player that he used to be. Guards are really having a fairly easy time getting around him at this point, and it feels like every time you watch an opposing team's broadcast when they play Boston or like ESPN or something, their broadcast crew is always like, "Oh, Marcus is the heart and soul of this team. Like he's such a monster on defense and this and that and the other." And he was a couple of years ago, but at this point, it looks like it might be coming to an end for him being, just a all-time defensive stopper. As presently constructed, I just don't see a way that this team can kind of compete for a title. I think they'll be lucky to kind of sneak into the playoffs with this current roster, relying on the weaknesses they had last year. Center and point guard are the same weaknesses they have this year. Bringing in 85-year-old Al Horford to anchor your defense. Turns out that that's not really a great decision. He's been good for them this year, but what they need him to do, he's just at this stage, he's better coming off the bench for something like that. And they've got him starting alongside Robert Williams, who is coming along. But I mean, as a 6'7" center or post player, I think the limit on what he can do is, it's going to be fairly low. He's not going to be really the answer that they need at center. But the biggest weakness, I think, for them is point guard. In defense of Marcus Smart, I've talked about his defense a little bit. Offensively, he's not really been great. I mean, I criticized the 0 assists for him in that game, and he takes some atrocious shots, and they've got him at point guard, which is kind of a miscast for him. He's not a pure point guard, and for them to kind of ask that of him is a little unfair. Also, don't love Dennis Schroeder as like a playmaking point guard. He's more of like a spark plug off the bench kind of a guy, like get you some quick buckets, lead the second unit. So they don't really have a playmaker on this roster. And what Marcus said about Jalen and Jason not being playmakers, that is the next step for both of their games. Like they do need to do that. So nothing Marcus said was particularly wrong. It was just weird coming from him, and also kind of a weird way to do it, to just out everyone publicly after a crushing defeat. Yeah, I mean, offensively too, schematically, it's very weird. They get pretty decent ball movement and player movement to a point, but then once the ball goes to Jason or Jalen, everybody just like freezes. Like they're just like, mission accomplished. We got one of those guys the ball. Everybody just stand there. And nobody looks particularly ready to shoot. Like they just know like a shot's going up. And it seems like you would want to keep guys moving and keep guys cutting to help those two out, like give them an option to throw to. If you look at a lot of the possessions in the Bulls game in particular, that Marcus is like, why didn't they pass out of the double team? And it's like, well, everybody was just standing around. There wasn't really a lot to throw to. I don't know. As far as like whether Jason and Jalen can be a championship tandem, I've seen a lot of that going around, even going back to last year. It's like, well, do the Celtics need to trade one of these two guys? Is it ever going to work? We've seen this group in the conference, finals multiple times. Particularly, in 2020, they were the two main reasons they were there. They were the two most important players. They got to a conference finals and they had a chance to beat Miami. It wasn't as if it was just a complete talent disparity or Boston got completely blown out in that series. They had a couple of bad breaks and, they probably weren't better than Miami that year, but I wouldn't have been surprised to see them move on past that round and into the finals. So it's not as if we don't have any history to point to with these two in particular having success. The counter argument to that is I went back and kind of looked at throughout history, how many wing tandems like this have we seen win an NBA championship? It looked like the first one I could find was Rick Barry and Jamal Wilkes. That was in 1975, before I was born. So I don't really have a lot to say about them or whether Jamal Wilkes was even the second most important player on that team. I don't know so that one's questionable. The other questionable one, Steph and Clay. Some people consider Steph like a two guard. I don't. I think he's a point guard. So I'm not going to count that one. The two best examples we have of like wing tandems, two most important players, wings, winning the championship, Jordan and Pippen, and then LeBron and Wade in Miami. I guess so. So we do have that. It's particularly with the Jordan and Pippen thing, one of the most successful teams of all time with those two as your main pieces. Now, the counter argument, of course, is that between Jason and Jalen, neither of them are really playmaking type wings, whereas particularly with either of these combos, Jordan and Pippen and LeBron and Wade, with Jordan and Pippen, obviously Michael Jordan was more of the score first guy, and Pippen was one of the first point forwards we had seen in the league. He was definitely more geared towards playmaking and getting other guys involved. So they had complementary skill sets. It wasn't just two score first guys. Same thing with LeBron and Wade. Wade had some playmaking to him, but definitely scoring was more of his forte. And LeBron was definitely more geared towards the playmaking side. even though he could fill it up offensively as well. So both of those combos that are championship caliber wing combos, both had wings with complementary skill sets, and they weren't both geared only towards scoring or mostly towards scoring. That's the bad thing for the Jason and Jalen combo. I still wouldn't want to give up on this. Both seem pretty happy to be in Boston and continue with this team. And honestly, the success or lack thereof in this case is not attributed to their play. I think it's more the roster around them. There's just not a ton of talent here. There's not a ton of shooting either. They picked Aaron Nesmith last year and they expected him to be an awesome shooter for them. He's kind of getting it together this year, but definitely last year he wasn't there. And you still like to see more out of him. Marcus Smart, I think it's time to look at dealing him. I know that would be really sad. And Boston sometimes just lacks energy, and he's kind of the only energy guy. But he's really one of the only pieces of value that you can move to try and improve this roster. And they desperately need to improve. They were really quiet during free agency, to the criticism of a lot of people. And I think that's fair. There were some point guards out there like Lonzo Ball who could have really helped them. And I think they could have probably talked the Pelicans into taking Marcus Smart back in like some type of sign and trade situation. So we'll see if they can get it back together. I think as constructed currently, I think this may be a team bound for the lottery, especially with the Jaylen Brown piece where he's kind of hurt now with a hamstring issue, I believe. So anytime you're dealing with muscles, that just takes time as far as recovery. So if they continue to kind of go down the losing path, I don't know. I could definitely see this team bottoming out of the lottery, but I think they can still, at the very least, sneak into a play-in spot and maybe make life difficult for a team. But we'll see how they do.